Everybody, I will give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails 1215th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Carlos Basualdo and Michelle White. And now I'll introduce Carlos and Michelle. Carlos Basualdo is the incoming director of the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas. He's the author of Cy Twombly, 50 Days at Iliam. And based in Houston, Texas, Michelle White is Senior Curator at the Menil Collection and is currently working on a show of the fabric works of Robert Rauschenberg. During her tenure at the museum, she has organized exhibitions on the work of Chryssa, Tacita Dean, Richard Serra, Leslie Hewitt, Vija Celmins, Barnett Newman, Walter de Maria, Allora y Calzadilla, Roni and Mona Hatoum, among many others. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Michelle and Carlos to get started.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to talk to Michelle, a colleague that I admire profoundly, and to celebrate this centenary, which is so auspicious in many ways. Yeah. Sorry, not centenary. I'm thinking. I thought about Rauschenberg. It's 30 years, correct?
30 years. So we're in the middle of a celebratory season of celebrating the 30th anniversary of the opening of the Menil Cy Twombly Gallery. And this is a very important day, too, because it's Cy Twombly's birthday.
Yay!
So what a great day to have this conversation.
So we were, many of you might have been to the Menil, and I'm sure that, there's many destinations at the Menil, and the Cy Twombly building is certainly one of them. I mean, Michelle and I, before in the preparation talk, were conversing a little bit about legacy and how Cy thought about his own legacy. So I'd like to ask Michelle what her feelings are when she steps into that room, thinking about Cy's work and how he himself thought about posterity.
Right. I mean, it is such a novel concept that we have essentially a permanent exhibition and a permanent retrospective exhibition of an artist's work. And the galleries cover the years 1952 through 2008. So even after the building opens in 1995, Twombly donated more works to extend the scope of the works presented. And I think it's really astounding fact that we have this in Houston. I often say to our Houston audiences, if all of these works travel to Europe, there would be lines around the block to see this, and it is such an honor to oversee this building that allows visitors to come in and see this work on a daily basis, if you'd like. And I think about that privilege of access often. We're a free institution, and specifically the orientation of the building in relationship to the Menil Collection is such that it faces a lovely green space. We can go to one of the exterior images. And this was quite intentional in terms of the design of the building, that it doesn't face the street. It faces a quite idyllic park-like space. In fact, both the architect and the artist were quite enamored with that beautiful American live oak tree that you see in this image, and the orientation of the entry face that. So I think for me, walking into that building, and I think this is something that's experienced by so many of our visitors, is that it is a very special experience. And together with the art, the architecture, it feels like you are in a different space. It's a kind of timelessness that really pervades the experience, and is the intention of the artist and architect to create that environment.
I think that what you're mentioning about timelessness is quite interesting in the context of Cy, as his work is always such a, I would say, a reflection on the passing of time, an assertion against the passing of time, a sort of amorous conflict with time itself. And I think that might be one of the reasons why it seems it was so important for him to have a group of his works, such an important group of his works together. He, as you said, it's 30 years since it's open, and in a way, when it opened, it was a retrospective. It was a small, compressed retrospective. But then he would go on to live, for another 2 decades and more. And did he change his mind about the works that were there? Did he add it, subtract it? Was he actively in dialogue with the Menil in terms of that display?
So it's a great question. Let's maybe go into an interior image. There's been changes over the years, and certainly in the last 2 decades of his life, he continued to have conversations with us. Work was given. Again, there's a few sculptures that were added after the opening, and a few paintings that moved around. So while the dialogue was there wasn't any kind of radical changes from the initial installation that he worked on. I think the biggest shift between 95 and 96 especially was the addition to the galleries of the monumental painting Say Goodbye Catalyst.
And that's I think it's his largest single panel paint. Well, it's organized in several panels, but I think it's one of his largest works, right?
So interesting. It is his largest work. It's a 3-panel painting.
Mm-hmm.
It's 56 feet long. It's just stunning, and it fits that room so beautifully. But when the building opened, in the place of this work, which is such an iconic work in the gallery, the work Treatise on the Veil, the second version from 1971, was installed here. And in fact, that is his largest single canvas, 33 feet. That's in the Menil Collection. And this work came a year later. So again, the idea of this kind of being a concrete or set in stone installation is not in the kind of conception of what this gallery is, what this museum is. And certainly we've lent works from these spaces to other important retrospectives of the artists, and things have shuffled a bit. But the goal for us is to keep the idea intact, because the artist was so instrumental in making all the decisions about where the works went, and also what groups of work would go into each gallery.
Mm-hmm.
And the galleries, as he described, well, they're loosely chronological as you move through the 9-room configuration. As the artist described, he wanted each room to have a certain atmospheric or emotional quality. So there's not, strict chronological parameters.
And you mentioned before how deliberate he was in terms of the conversations with piano about the dimensions of the room and what was going to be hanging where. So he was actually not hands off at all in terms of how everything looks right now, right?
He was not hands off. And he was involved in all decisions, and we have just an incredible archive of correspondence, how he weighed into the particular sand grain that would form the concrete blocks on the exterior, to the door handles, to the proportions of the galleries.
Wow.
It was everything. In fact, when Paul Winkler was the director when the galleries opened, and was incredibly instrumental in making this all happen. And in one of his talks reflecting on these galleries, he said it was Twombly who was the architect of the spacing, and Twombly was the light.
And
Not piano was the light. Twombly was the space. piano was the light in the conversation that led to this.
It makes total sense. Even I think that some of the the installation devices, I mean, the bases, the way in which you have treated the bases for the sculptures, I think that they have become, the parameters with everybody who wanted to work according to size intentions would do the bases. So there's many things I think that are exemplary, really, of the way in which the work should be installed and have carried on and have a legacy beyond the installation. I think the the collaboration with piano. Do you know if they knew each other from before, or was piano a choice of the Menils? How did it come about?
It's a great question. I don't know if Piano and Twombly had met prior, although of course their time in Italy, I can't imagine their paths would not have crossed. But the decision about Twombly came because Piano had just designed the museum's main building, which opened in 1987. So when they approached Piano, really not long after that, it really did provide Piano a very unique opportunity that within architecture you don't often see, that the architect is then able to, which he did, respond to his other building, which was quite new still. And it's fascinating too to compare the two buildings. And I'm sorry we don't have a image of the 1987 building by Piano that houses the Menil Collection. But the light especially is wildly different. The main museum, of course, as was discussed by Mrs. de Menil and Piano, that when you're in this building, the light is so important because it connects you with a place, if not kind of this idea of domesticity, that when you're in your kitchen and the light passes and reflections pull across the wall and shadows animate the space. This was really important, especially for Mrs. de Menil, because it placed you with a work of art in real time, that it connects you to this idea that art is of your own world. The light in the Twombly Gallery is different and goes back to what you were saying about this idea of temporality, specifically timelessness. And the light in these spaces are controlled by these essentially different planes in the ceiling. It all comes through the ceiling of different ways to filter the Texas sun, which if you've been here, it's very bright and can be quite brutal, from glass planes to the last layer essentially that you see in the gallery. You can see in this image, it's a piece of cotton duct that's been stretched across the ceiling. And you can even see the fasteners. And these were done by a sailmaker here in Galveston Bay. But it gives this sensation of, again, timelessness, that that even as the sun shifts and clouds pass, the light is incredibly stable in this space.
And in terms of the sequence of buildings at the Menil, was this after the main building one of the first, or did it come after the Rothko Chapel? How does it fit in terms of the campus, the history of the campus?
Sure. So the first building is the Rothko Chapel, which opens in 1971, and opens on the property that the de Menils were building in this neighborhood. The main museum opens in 1987. And then this is the second building opening in 1995. What's interesting then is in the mid-90s, this is quite an intense time here, because then in 1996, the Dan Flavin installation opens a year later. and then comes the Byzantine fresco chapel building in 1997. Once that's complete, the Menil doesn't add to the campus until 2018 with the opening of the Menil Drawing Institute.
Yes.
So this becomes an important building to essentially sort of carry out what was the master plan for this neighborhood, is a series of buildings on a campus devoted to art.
And at the same time, it's different from the other buildings in the sense that it's the only one that it houses a mini retrospective in a way, which is not so mini because it's really made of incredibly substantial works. I mean, I wanted to ask you about two things about that, but the first one is to point out that when the works first came, they were all in the collection of Cy. Is that right?
No. As the idea was being conceived for the gallery, as conversations were getting going, one of the reasons why Paul Winkler had started thinking about spaces devoted to Twombly is because the Menil at the time was holding in our storage the Dia Twombly paintings, and was quite keen to do something with the paintings and do a presentation while they were here, which ignited the conversation with Twombly. And that conversation was held with Heiner Friedrich and Faria Friedrich, the founders of Dia, along with Helen Winkler. And together with Mrs. de Menil, they went to Rome to have this conversation, like, let's do something with the Dia paintings. The Menil at the time owned about 2 major paintings that were acquired by Mrs. de Menil. And as the conversations got going, as Twombly, as we know, was sketching these galleries long before Renzo Piano got involved, he started letting the Menil know that if spaces were devoted to his work, he would throw in some paintings.
Yeah. So that's interesting. It connects a little bit, you know, we spoke also about this offline with the history of the Philadelphia room that we can go into a little bit later. But I mean, I think that the in a way, the interesting thing for me about all of this is how deliberate Cy was about the works. You know, from the beginning to, you know, the installation and before, he was very deliberate about the works that would be housed there. And there's really incredible, absolutely outstanding works. And I think it's absolutely inconceivable for any curator, you know, to think about any Twombly show of substance without some of those works. So I can imagine that, you know, it must be quite hard institutionally, because I'm sure that you're fending a lot of requests all the time. But further than that, I cannot think of any other. Can you think of any other instance in the US of a museum that at that time housed sort of a retrospective view of an artist's work?
I mean, that's a great question. And I was excited to have a conversation with you because, you know, we should bring up 50 Days at Iliam, because did it open in 1988 at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And while it's not a retrospective presentation, this notion of permanence or semi-permanence in terms of how, you know, we can think about how Twombly might have been conceiving of his work as a long-term presentation is quite fascinating, because Philadelphia, you know, comes before the Menil Cy Twombly Gallery. And what did it mean for the artist to sort of think through his works in those terms and as kind of spaces devoted to his work?
Yeah, and no, and in Philadelphia, you know, it sort of in a circular way brings us back to this idea of memorializing an artist, because the work, the room came about. It was initially a proposal by Mark Rosenthal, who was curator of modern and contemporary art, and he actually was inspired by what Anne Darnoncourt had done after the museum installed AC, air conditioning, in the galleries in 1974. Yes. Before that, there was no air conditioning in the galleries. And I hear stories about the curators leaving to Europe for the whole summer. which sounds quite nice. Then AC was installed. There was an opportunity to reinstall the collections, and Anne decided to create a room for the works of Marcel Duchamp, which in fact still is still there, and it's a sort of a small retrospective of Duchamp. I mean, small, not so small. Again, like the Menil Twombly building, because it includes the large glass and the Tandonnet, so arguably the two most important works that he ever did, as well with a selection of other works that came through Walter and Louis Arensberg. In parallel to that, Anne also installed an entire room with works by Constantin Brancusi. So again, the Brancusi room is less, in a way, narrative in terms of a historical, parcours through the artist, but it still has that density of, that you could connect to the idea of a survey or retrospective. So Mark Rosendahl comes as a young curator, looks at these two rooms, says, well, I would like to do a room with a living artist, and starts talking to Cy. So at the beginning, the conversation was not about 50 days. I mean, it was going to be a room of Twombly. And then, of course, 50 days was still, in possession of the artist. The work had been shown at Heiner Friedrich Gallery in the 70s, and they reached an agreement about the work coming to the museum. Now, it's interesting because whenever, I had an opportunity to talk to Cy or to Nicola Del Roscio, who is the president of the Cy Twombly Foundation, and met Cy for the first time in 1964. So this is a lifelong conversation that they had. It was always, in a way, the Philadelphia installation and the Menil installation were very present in their minds, as if deeply connected. And I think, in many ways, that Philadelphia was, was important for Cy in the way that he also allowed him to think about Menil. I think that, as I said, he was both happy and had some concerns about the Philadelphia installation, mostly in terms of the installation itself. And I think with the Menil, he had the opportunity of really getting it right, as he
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And learning from Philadelphia. And I just think this conversation between Philadelphia and the Menil is really interesting too. And fun fact, as I was getting ready for the talk, something I didn't realize is that the Menil director at the time asked Twombly to borrow 50 days for the opening of the Menil Collection in 1987. There was no response. But work continued with Twombly. But it is an interesting connection. And Carlos, I love this idea too of what was going on in the 1970s. Also thinking about Heiner Friedrich's role. We know beginning in the late 60s, he's talking to Twombly about finding a permanent space for his work. This was part of the early conversations leading to Dia in the late 60s. So we know, because kind of Heiner's behind this, that these ideas of permanence and devoted spaces that have a kind of architectural sensitivity would have been something that Twombly was thinking about long before.
Yes, absolutely. And even to add to that, I mean, when I was looking into the paintings themselves, why they were painted and so forth, it was interesting that Cy painted them in a studio, which is in fact like an extraordinary building in Bassano, in the north of Rome. It's about an hour and a half in what used to be Tuscan territory. And the interesting thing about Bassano is that it's a very old building, and so it has enormous rooms. And Cy was scouting places in Rome to have big spaces, right? At the time when then he found the building, which if I remember correctly, was found by his wife, by Tatiana Franchetti, then the conversations with Heiner Friedrich had already started. So I wouldn't be surprised, and that's something that I mentioned in the text, if he would have painted this series thinking about the room that was going to, or the museum, the space that was going to be devoted for his work, right? And that, without another level of interconnection between Philadelphia and the Menil.
Mhm. And can you, I have a question about these two, also thinking about, in thinking about the Menil and thinking about decisions the artist would have made to achieve these groupings in each room. I think what's so unique about 50 Days is that there is more of a kind of narrative sequence, or as much as there can be for Cy Twombly. When he was painting these works, did you look at kind of the arrangement of how he had them on the walls of his studios, and did that kind of reflect ultimately how they were hung?
He had a very clear idea of how they should be shown, and there is a drawing in which you actually see the positions of the work. Um, when he painted them in Bassano, he used different rooms, and so there's photographs. Annabelle Duarte, who is this extraordinary French photographer, visited Bassano and took pictures, and you could see that the works were spread all through the rooms, but he had a very clear plan for the installation. When Heiner showed the work in his gallery in New York, he didn't have the appropriate space, and so the works were all on one wall. That show happened more or less at the time of the Whitney retrospective, which was not received very warmly. And we can talk about reception. That's an interesting chapter, I think, for both of us. But ultimately, when they went to Philadelphia, there were conversations about trying to adapt to the first, ideas that Cy had about the rooms. There's definitely a narrative going on, some kind of narrative, as you said. I mean, it's not linear, properly speaking, but one could, create different, itineraries in the room in which, a chronology comes into play. I think that what was striking to me is that he goes back to a certain mode of depiction that was characteristic in the 60s, earlier. And because right after these works, he was doing, works that were a lot more, less blatantly about Greco-Roman mythology and more predicated on structure. And I think in some degree in the literature, those works have been described as a reaction to minimalism to some degree, but also to the reception again of that first wonderful important series, which is Commodus, which was shown at the Castelli Gallery. You would enter and see a Roman bust, and then you will see these shows, and the show was heavily criticized, among others by Donald Judd, right? So Twombly, it's important to keep in mind, had been living in Europe for decades by then. Was, although he was a central part of the conversation in the New York of the 1950s, he had somewhat abandoned that centrality, and he had a very complicated feelings about that distance. I mean, that could be an entire conversation. He felt at times, quite excluded from what was happening in New York. I would say that gave him a lot of freedom to explore a different temporality in his work than most American artists at the time. But he experienced that both as a privilege and with a certain sense of isolation. The reception of Commodus was quite disappointing for him, and so all these ideas about, hey, I'm going to have an opportunity to have my own space. It's going to be of a survey nature, so I can really show what my work is about. I think this was truly key for him. Right.
Right. And I love that you're bringing up reception, because as we're also thinking about, like, here's a whole building, how are you going to fill it? The fact that in the early 90s, Twombly had so much work. In fact, when he was thinking about the Menil spaces and the rooms, many of the works that come to Houston have never been shown, or they've only been shown once. So this idea that he's working out of the United States, he's working, away from the thin center of the art world, he also just wasn't getting the reception. He didn't have the market, all of the things that we sort of take for granted today with an artist who's so esteemed, such as Twombly. But I have to say, it's been really fascinating going back through the press when the building opened 30 years ago, and it's still striking. So some of the headlines read, "Why Twombly?" or "The Menil Collection opens a controversial space," which just stopped me in my tracks. And I was like, "Oh, what is this?" And I was like, "Oh, it's Twombly." Like Twombly was, and not that he still isn't for many of our audiences that I watch going through the space, but how not only unknown, but how challenging his work was seen as late as the mid 1990s.
Absolutely. And I think that, when one speaks about the reception of Comodos and, one is mostly talking about specialized press, but it is exactly what you said with the general public. I mean, the reception was much worse in terms of the general public. And why Twombly was the question that was posed to both Anne and Mark when they brought the room to Philadelphia. Why Twombly? For many years, I mean, in the files, you can find these very kind and precise letters, and thanking, the distinguished curator, chief of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, basically was in Philadelphia at the time and was responding very kindly to people who wrote scathing letters about their role. Why are you having that in the museum? It really was very interesting. And as you said, it's important to keep that in mind. The reception of Twombly, now it seems, he's accepted as one of the canonical figures of 20th century. That was not the way in 1889 or in the 90s.
And even Chloe, if you go back to that slide with the all white paintings, I love this story. This is the room devoted to the Lexington paintings. There's 5 Lexington paintings from 1960, 61. And when the building opened, this was the first time this group of paintings had been shown. Famously, and this is in the archives and in the writings, he had sent them to Leo Castelli in the 1960s. And Leo Castelli, of course, he's someone who is well versed on, avant-garde production, said, "I don't know what to do with these," and sent them back to Twombly, where they remained in his possession until this building opened. So that idea that he was working not only outside of the United States, but working in a way that was and continues to be challenging intellectually, I think is something I really enjoy pointing out when I bring groups through this space.
Definitely, and those Lexington works are exquisite, and now we can look at them in a completely different way. But it's absolutely, as you said, at the time they simply, I mean, their works that Cy did in one of his trips to Lexington, where he kept a studio until the end of his life. That's the place, I mean, that he would go. He would spend at times. He had decided to spend some time in New York, but then he wasn't entirely comfortable there. So Lexington became really a very important place for him, where he had many friends, intellectuals and artists. Sally Mann, one of them.
Yeah.
So in terms of, I think that although this has been announced, I think, Michelle, would you tell us a little bit about the gift that you recently, because it's such an important gift?
Yeah, again, we've had an incredible season of Twombly celebrations here, and we were thrilled. We're so excited with thanks to the Cy Twombly Foundation. We received a group of gifts, including, as you can see here, a very important work from 1954. This had been in the installation of the gallery since we opened, but it remained in the collection of the Twombly Foundation. It has now become a gift to the Menil, and it's untitled from 1954. And we also received as a gift Volubilis from 1953. Chloe, I think if you go to the previous, let's see. Oh, 21. Oh, no. Oh my gosh, I cannot see those little slides, Chloe. It's the piece with the sort of arch that, oh, there we go, 15. There it is on the left, Volubilis. This came out of Twombly's formative travel to Southern Europe and North Africa with Robert Rauschenberg. That really kind of expanded his mind about the Mediterranean world. So we are thrilled. And along with these two paintings, we have received a gift from the foundation of 120 drawings.
And when you mentioned the Mediterranean world, that resonates also very much to me, because I think that for Cy it was key, and he was a traveler, as you know, and his works incorporate in many, many ways, this experience of moving, geographically as much as moving in time. He was a traveler through time, and he was a traveler in space, a quite adventurous one, going to Afghanistan in the 1970s and so forth. And this sort of and the Mediterranean as a whole was meaningful to him. And that was a conception that was not, again, common at the time, not for the Europeans either. So he was an explorer, very open to other cultures, very, very open to other times. And I think that's in his generation, is absolutely unique.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the Mediterranean, I think it's nice to note too that one of the really distinguishing aspects of the building's architecture are the walls. The walls are an unpigmented plaster, which means they have quite a sense of depth and also help with this idea of light because it absorbs the light. It helps with kind of creating this atmosphere that you're talking about without time in a way. There's one room in the gallery without natural light above. This is the central core. We're looking at it now. This houses the blackboard works from the late 60s, early 70s. That's the central room, which has no natural light. The other galleries around this room have the overhead sunlight.
And you are planning a number of events and lectures to celebrate this anniversary?
We're really concluding the season now. One really important event we had, and this kind of goes back to your question, also like curatorially, as we have this permanent space to an artist and what legacy means. It's complicated. We don't want this space to feel like it's a mausoleum, that there's no activation or relevance, I think, to the contemporary moment. And one of the big projects we did around this season is that we collaborated with the artist Tacita Dean. She, the British German artist, we did a big exhibition, but part of that was thinking about how she could create new work out of the Cy Twombly Gallery. She was close to Twombly at the end of his life, did some film portraits of him, and she was here for a while. She was thinking about like how to be with Twombly and think through this space, and she asked us if she could spend the night in the Cy Twombly galleries. She wanted her own space and time to do it. And so last February, she spent 12 hours by herself in the Cy Twombly galleries. She brought her camera and she came out with this stunning group of new works for which we've published an artist's book of her time in these galleries with Twombly. And for me, this is really exciting because it sets, a model of thinking through legacy by thinking through and inviting artists to respond now and in this place and in this time. and to think more about what that means and what the possibilities of these types of conversations can be.
Wonderful, fantastic. So I think that we might be ready to. I see a number of questions, so maybe we move on to open the floor and try to answer some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Carlos and Michelle. This has been such a pleasure to listen to. If you have a question for Carlos and Michelle, please submit it at the link in the chat, and I will turn to you next. I'll kick off the Q&A by asking, I'm curious about the collaboration with Renzo Piano on the architecture at that moment in Cy's career, and whether each of you thinks it had an influence on Cy's later projects and works. I'm thinking about the ceiling work at the Louvre and like the way that he intervened with architecture thereafter, and how you think it influenced his work from there.
Well, I think he was very happy with it. I think that he had. It's interesting because Annabelle Duarte, when she visited Cy, in Bassano, Cy invited her to go to Bassano, but she started, by visiting his house in Rome, and she said, the house is an installation. And she didn't really have a word for installation, but the way in which she described it is that's how she felt he conceived of the space. I think that my feeling is that the first time that he could really realize his vision was in the Menil, in this conversation with, so I think it produced a lasting impact in the sense that it became a model and a very high standard, I think, and I'm sure that he measured many of the subsequent installations based on that.
And I'll add, though, while we might go so far as to say he achieved what he wanted with the Menil Gallery, we have to note that we know he had long had great sensitivity to architecture. He studied architecture. I love this story, that the kind of idea immediately of having a space to his work, and he started sketching based on classical proportions, based on his deep knowledge of Roman architecture too. So I don't think, I sometimes also think that the Houston building is a bit of a culmination of his lifelong, pursuit of that aspect of his way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Piano himself, I'm heading to the Nasher, and he described the Nasher as a sort of modern Roman villa, right? So that's as very, in Italy, you find that it's very common, for both architects and artists. The relationship with the past is not oppositional, and they think about it as part of their DNA. And I think that I also thought of many different paths and many different cultures as part of his DNA. So it was a natural dialogue.
Thank you both so much for that answer. I have a question from Greg. Greg asks, did Twombly visit these spaces regularly? And if so, how? It's coming out in the last few years that Twombly used Polaroid photography fairly actively as a tool to document details and moments in his work and life. These installations feel like the other end of the spectrum in terms of a tool for understanding his practice.
So your question is if Twombly regularly came back to Houston. He did. I apologize. I don't know offhand how many times he came between the opening and 2011. But yes, he did come back. He was quite active with our conservation team. A lot of restoration work and conservation concerns were happening, especially, with these works, like, some had never been shown, like the Lexington work. So conversations around treatment and care were quite active. They were led by Carol Mancusi-Ungaro, who's still thinking a lot about Twombly, writing a Twombly book now. So that really, I think, sustained an active dialogue with the Menil. And if you are a Twombly fan. I cannot recommend enough on the Menil's website devoted to our artist documentation program. This is a space where artists are engaged with conservators to talk about materials and methods. There's an incredible conversation between Carol and Twombly. Twombly did not want to get filmed, but you hear his voice as the camera scrolls through the gallery and he responds to the work. I think it's about a decade after the building opened. And it's really lovely because you can see, an artist responding to things he forgot about, or what it looks like now, or what he might have been thinking about when he was making it. There's also a great part where she asked, "What does that say?" And he said, "I don't know." So it gives you a lot of insight to how he thought about his works retrospectively and in this space.
Thank you so much for that answer. The next question is from David. Can we hear more about Twombly's relationship with the Menil Collection and other significant institutions? Can we hear more about how Twombly's relationship with the Menil and other significant institutions was influenced by Larry Gagosian? Carlos, you want to start?
One thing to say is that Larry comes into the picture, towards the end of Cy's career. Incredibly important, and Cy adored Larry. I think it was super important for the promotion of the work. But when we're going into these years, it's a different cast of characters, really. So first is Castelli, and Castelli. As and the complicated conversations with Castelli. I haven't looked into that in detail, but it's very clear that Castelli, the artist that really loomed large in the gallery was Jasper Johns, and as you know, Jasper and Robert Rauschenberg and Cy had, a very, very close and complicated relationship. And so, this enters, this is where the professional and the personal are inseparable. Then, of course, the conversation with Heiner Friedrich, and I think that's where, the Dia connection starts. So all of this is, the historical, the history that accounts for the creations of these rooms. I think that then later on in his life, he starts working with Larry, and I know that it was tremendously important for Cy.
And I'll note for Gagosian, really importantly, Say Goodbye Catalyst was shown first at the Gagosian Soho Loft a year before the Cy Twombly Gallery opens. At the time, the painting was called Anatomy of Melancholy, but that was quite an important exhibition around this time.
Thank you for those answers. I'm going to ask a question now about, I think I'll close this out unless anyone else has another question. I'm curious about Cy's reading. I know reading was a really big part of Cy's practice, and when in the gallery, there's so much to decipher and read in many of the paintings. And so I'd love to hear each of you speak a little bit about how reading was part of Cy's work, and also that experience maybe when hanging the paintings or thinking about the curation of the space.
Yeah, well, reading and music were very important for Cy, and he was a voracious reader, of course, of the classics, first and foremost, but of anything really, and he wrote, many, so much, and I think that there's a 6 or 8 volume text done by an extraordinary scholar, compiling all his writings. So that it's great that you brought that up, Chloe, because it's an important aspect of him, and it's difficult to make it present in the context of a museum.
It's I just love watching people in the galleries. I learned so much. And it's fascinating to watch. There's some people have this tendency when they see words, they want to understand every word. And it's lovely to watch how Twombly flirts with the audience here, because as soon as you sort of start to piece it together, or analyze what the sentence might say, it becomes quite a complicated process. And what he does is that he essentially sort of enacts how he's thinking about text that often is sort of filtered through his own memory that's not precise. It might be a line of how he remembers reading something, but it fails to align precisely with a quote he might be referencing. And Carlos, I love that you brought up that book, which is so important to Twombly's scholarship, and it's multi-volume, and it analyzes every text everywhere Twombly ever did in any of his paintings and provides you the exact source. And what you can see so clearly in that process is that what he's quoting is often so far from what is actually being said by an author he might be quoting. But that it's that space in between. It's that space of inviting the viewer to try and read something, to kind of hit that human desire to do so, and then kind of pushing back against it. That is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and we are entering the complicated territory of the relationship between the sign and the icon in his work, which is, Roland Barthes, very eloquently wrote on that. But as Michelle says, when he's writing, he's drawing. When he's drawing, he's writing. And at times it becomes impossible to distinguish what he's doing. And at times he's incredibly deliberate in terms of how he quotes and certain people, and at times he's incredibly free in terms of reinterpreting a verse or a line, or even the way in which a word is spelled. Yeah. And it's all part of this sort of exercise, experimental exercise of freedom. It's a phrase that Oiticica wrote to refer to his work, but one could really use it for Cy as well.
Thank you both so much for this conversation today and for those answers to our questions. I'm going to pass the microphone to you now, Carlos, for the poems that we're going to conclude with.
Thank you. So Michelle and I spoke about what we could try to do, and we agreed that this could be a good idea. So these are two translations by Ezra Pound. The first is Catullus 85, and it's a very famous, and Ezra Pound translation is beautiful. I hate and love. Why? You may ask, but it beats me. I feel it done to me an ache. And the second one is, this monument will outlast, from Horace. So this is the Cy. This monument will outlast metal, and I made it more durable than the king's seat, higher than pyramids. Know of the wind and rain? Impotent the flow of the years to break it, however many. Bits of me, many bits, will dodge all funeral. O Libitina Persephone, and after that spout new praise. As long as Pontifex and the quiet girl pace the capital, I shall be spoken where the wild flood of Phidias lashes, and Daunos ruled the parched farmland. Power from lowliness first brought Aeolic song to Italian fashion, where pride works gains. O Muse Melpomene, by your will bind the laurel, my hair Delphic laurel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for that conclusion. Thank you, Carlos and Michelle. Thank you to everyone at the Menil Collection, especially Sarah Hobson, for their support in preparing for today's event. I'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the New Social Environment program and making conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our archive, where this will be soon. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work at the link in the chat. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with the artist Rose Selene on the occasion of Periphery in Red, Yellow, Blue on view at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. And as is real tradition, you can now unmute to say hello and goodbye, or perhaps today we'll all say happy birthday to Cy Twombly, since it's Cy Twombly's birthday. It's so great to see you all today, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Grazie mille.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Birthday,
you.
Cy.
Happy birthday, Cy.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Michelle. Thank you,
Grazie.
Marla. Thank you, Chloe.
Bye, everybody.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.